The city skyline stretched out before them, a tapestry of twinkling lights against the velvet darkness of the night. It was 3 a.m., that strange hour when the world seems suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, when truths are easier to speak and hearts more willing to listen. Ethan leaned against the metal railing of the balcony, his fingers wrapped around a half-empty glass of whiskey. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stuffiness of the apartment behind him, where the remnants of a party still lingered, music playing at a lower volume now, conversations having dwindled to intimate murmurs between the few guests who remained. Ethan hadn't planned on hosting a gathering that stretched into the early morning hours. As an artist who cherished his solitude, large social events often left him feeling drained, his social battery depleted long before the last guest departed. He'd organized the party at his roommate's insistence. "You need to get out of your head sometimes," Mia had told him with that knowing look of hers. And she wasn't wrong. The past few months had been a blur of deadlines and creative blocks, his paintings becoming increasingly introspective and somber. Perhaps that's why he'd finally agreed, though he now found himself seeking refuge on his own balcony, away from the noise and expectations. The sliding door behind him opened with a gentle whoosh, and Ethan didn't need to turn to know who had joined him. There was something distinctive about Jake's presence, a certain energy that seemed to alter the atmosphere around him. Jake, the charismatic bartender from the pub down the street, who had somehow become a fixture in Ethan's life over the past year. They'd met when Ethan had wandered in one rainy evening, seeking shelter and inspiration, and found both in the form of the man who now stood beside him. "Thought I might find you out here," Jake said, his voice carrying that slight rasp that came from years of raising it over the din of crowded bars. "Party too much for you?" Ethan smiled, still gazing out at the city below. "Just needed some air. You know how I get." "I do," Jake replied, and there was something in his tone that made Ethan finally turn to look at him. Jake was leaning against the railing too, his profile illuminated by the distant glow of the city. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his usual confident smile had softened into something more contemplative. "Though I have to say, for someone who claims to hate parties, you throw a pretty good one." "All me is doing," Ethan admitted with a small laugh. "I just provided the space and made sure we had enough alcohol to keep everyone happy." "And that artwork," Jake added, gesturing toward the apartment with his glass. "Don't think I didn't notice the new pieces on your walls. That sunset over the harbor. That's new, isn't it?" Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. Jake had noticed. Jake always noticed. "Finished it last week. I wasn't sure about the colors, actually. Thought maybe the oranges were too intense." "They're perfect," Jake said simply. "Makes you feel like you're right there, watching the day end." He took a sip of his drink, then added, "You've got a gift, Ethan. The way you see the world. It's something special." The conversation lulled into a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who don't feel the need to fill every moment with words. Below them, a taxi honked, the sound muffled by distance. Someone in a neighboring apartment was playing soft jazz, the melancholy notes of a saxophone drifting through the night air. Ethan became acutely aware of Jake's presence beside him, the slight scent of his cologne mingling with the whiskey on his breath, the way his forearm rested just inches from Ethan's on the railing. It had been this way for months now, this dance of proximity and retreat, of meaningful glances and conversations that seemed to hover on the edge of something more. Ethan had convinced himself it was all in his head, that Jake's natural charm and friendliness were simply part of who he was, not indicators of any special interest. After all, Jake was the type of person who made everyone feel like they were the most fascinating individual in the room. It was part of what made him such a successful bartender, that ability to connect, to make people feel seen. Jake shifted beside him, turning to look back at the apartment through the glass of the sliding door. The party had dwindled further. Only a handful of people remained, gathered in small clusters, deep in conversation. Mia caught Jake's eye through the glass and gave him a knowing smile before turning back to her conversation with a tall woman Ethan didn't recognize. "Looks like things are winding down in there," Jake observed. Then, in a move that would replay in Ethan's mind countless times in the days to come, he reached for the handle of the sliding door and pulled it closed. The sounds from inside were immediately muffled, creating a bubble of privacy around them. Jake turned back to face Ethan, taking a step closer. Hope you don't mind. It's easier to talk out here without having to shout over the music. Ethan's heart began to beat a little faster. No, I don't mind, he said, and was surprised by how steady his voice sounded despite the sudden flutter in his stomach. It's nice out here. Peaceful. Jake nodded, taking another step closer until they were standing just a foot apart. You know, I've always loved this view from your place. The whole city laid out like a map of possibilities. That's a poetic way of looking at it, Ethan replied, trying to keep his tone light despite the growing tension between them. I usually just see a bunch of buildings and lights. No, you don't, Jake said, his voice soft but certain. You see more than most people. It's what makes your art so compelling. You notice details others miss. Ethan felt exposed suddenly, as if Jake had peered directly into his soul. What kind of details? He asked, partly because he wanted to keep the conversation going, and partly because he genuinely wanted to know what Jake saw when he looked at him. Jake seemed to consider the question carefully. The way shadows fall across surfaces, how light changes the color of ordinary things, the expressions people wear when they think no one's watching. He paused, then added, like how you get this little crease between your eyebrows when you're concentrating on a conversation, but trying not to show how intensely you're listening. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his forehead, and Jake laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to wrap around Ethan like a blanket. You're doing it right now, Jake said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I didn't realize I was so transparent, Ethan murmured, feeling a blush creep up his neck. Not transparent, Jake corrected. Just readable, to someone who's paying attention. The implication hung in the air between them, that Jake had been paying attention, had been watching Ethan perhaps as closely as Ethan had been watching him. The city continued its nighttime symphony below them. Distant sirens, the occasional car horn, the constant hum of a metropolis that never truly sleeps. But on the balcony, time seemed to slow, each second stretching out as Ethan tried to decipher what was happening between them. Was this just friendly conversation, or was it veering into something more? Can I ask you something? Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Why did you invite me tonight? To your party, I mean. The question caught Ethan off guard. Well, we're friends, aren't we? And you know most of the people here anyway, through the bar. Jake nodded slowly, as if processing this answer. Friends, he repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. Is that what we are, Ethan? There was something in his tone, a vulnerability that Ethan had never heard from Jake before. It emboldened him. What do you think we are? He countered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake set his glass down on the small table beside them, then took another half-step closer. They were now standing close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from Jake's body, could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. I think, Jake began, his voice low and measured, that we've been circling something for months now, something neither of us has been brave enough to name. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment when the unspoken thing between them would finally be acknowledged. Part of him wanted to retreat, to laugh it off and suggest they rejoin the party. It would be safer that way. After all, he'd been down this road before, falling for someone who seemed interested, only to discover he'd misread the signals entirely. The rejection had been painful enough that he'd promised himself he wouldn't make the same mistake again. But another part of him, a stronger part, kept him rooted to the spot. Because this was Jake who remembered how he took his coffee, who texted him pictures of interesting cloud formations because he knew Ethan collected images for his paintings, who had once sat with him for hours in the hospital waiting room when Mia had her appendix removed, not because he had to, but because he knew Ethan hated hospitals. I'm not very good at this, Ethan admitted, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the city. At what? Jake prompted gently. At recognizing when someone is interested in me. At knowing the difference between friendliness and something more. Ethan swallowed hard, then added, at taking risks. Jake's expression softened, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Would it help if I made it really clear? No room for misinterpretation. Ethan nodded, his heart hammering so loudly in his chest he was certain Jake must be able to hear it. Jake reached out then, his hand coming to rest lightly on Ethan's arm. The touch was electric, sending a shiver up Ethan's spine despite the warmth of Jake's palm against his skin. I like you, Ethan. Not just as a friend. I have for a while now. The world seemed to narrow to just this moment, just this balcony suspended above the sleeping city. Ethan looked down at Jake's hand on his arm, then back up to meet his gaze. Why didn't you say something sooner? He asked, genuinely curious. Jake's thumb moved in a small, comforting circle against Ethan's skin. Honestly, I wasn't sure if you felt the same way. You're not exactly easy to read sometimes. And he hesitated, a flash of vulnerability crossing his features. I didn't want to mess up what we already had. Your friendship means a lot to me. Ethan understood that fear all too well. It was the same reason he'd kept his own feelings buried, convinced that the potential reward wasn't worth the risk of losing Jake from his life entirely. Mine too, he admitted. Your friendship, I mean. It's important to me. Jake nodded, his expression serious now. So where does that leave us? Standing on a balcony at 3 a.m., having finally admitted there's something here, but both too afraid to do anything about it? Put that way, it sounded absurd, and Ethan couldn't help but laugh. A soft, slightly nervous sound that seemed to break some of the tension between them. That would be pretty anticlimactic, wouldn't it? Jake's smile returned, brighter now. Extremely. And I don't know about you, but I think we deserve a better story than that. Ethan thought about all the moments that had led them here, the long conversations across the bar counter, the text messages that often stretched late into the night, the way his heart lifted whenever Jake walked into a room. He thought about his own fears, the walls he'd built to protect himself from disappointment. And then he thought about what it might be like to let those walls down, just a little, for someone who seemed genuinely worth the risk. I like you too, Ethan said finally, the words both terrifying and liberating as they left his lips. More than a friend. I have for, well, probably since that night you closed the bar early during that thunderstorm and we ended up talking until sunrise. Jake's expression brightened, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that always made Ethan's stomach flip. That was almost 6 months ago, he said, sounding both surprised and pleased. I know, Ethan admitted. I'm not exactly quick to act on these things. Better late than never, Jake replied, his hand sliding down from Ethan's arm to find his hand, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that belied the newness of this shift between them. And for what it's worth, I think I fell for you that same night. The way you described the lightning, like the sky was having a conversation with the earth. I'd never heard anyone talk that way before. Ethan remembered that night vividly, the rain lashing against the windows of the empty bar, the thunder that had rattled the glasses on the shelves, and the way Jake had listened to him ramble about the aesthetic qualities of storms with genuine interest rather than the polite tolerance he was accustomed to receiving. So what happens now? Ethan asked, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of Jake's hand in his. Jake seemed to consider this question carefully. Now, he said slowly, I think I'd very much like to kiss you, if that's something you'd be okay with. The directness of the statement sent a jolt through Ethan's body, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that left him momentarily speechless. He nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Jake moved closer still, his free hand coming up to gently cup Ethan's cheek. The touch was tender, almost reverent, and Ethan found himself leaning into it, his eyes closing briefly at the sensation. When he opened them again, Jake was looking at him with such warmth and affection that any remaining doubt Ethan might have harbored about Jake's feelings melted away. You're sure? Jake whispered, his breath warm against Ethan's lips. In response, Ethan closed the remaining distance between them, pressing his lips to Jake's in a kiss that started as gentle as a whisper but quickly deepened into something more insistent. Jake's hand moved from Ethan's cheek to the back of his neck, pulling him closer as their lips moved together in a rhythm that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if they'd been meant to find this connection all along. The world around them faded, the distant sounds of the city, the muffled music from the apartment, even the cool night air. All of it receded until there was nothing but this moment, this kiss, this man whose touch seemed to ignite something long dormant within Ethan. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Jake rested his forehead against Ethan's, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Wow, he murmured. Yeah, Ethan agreed, unable to formulate a more eloquent response. His mind was spinning, his body humming with a newfound energy. That was worth the wait, Jake suggested, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a mixture of humor and genuine question. Ethan nodded, a smile spreading across his face. Definitely worth the wait. They stayed like that for a moment, foreheads touching, hands intertwined, existing in the small bubble of privacy they'd created on the balcony. Below them, the city continued its nighttime existence. Taxis ferrying late-night revelers home, early morning workers beginning their commutes, the eternal cycle of urban life continuing unaware of the significant shift that had just occurred 20 stories above. You know, Jake said eventually, pulling back slightly to look at Ethan properly. I had this whole speech planned. Things I wanted to tell you about how I feel, what I think we could be together. But now that we're here, I'm finding it hard to remember any of it. Ethan laughed softly. You don't need a speech. Just tell me what you're thinking. Right now. Jake's expression grew serious, though his eyes remained warm. I'm thinking that I've never met anyone quite like you before. Someone who sees the world the way you do, who makes me notice things I would have otherwise missed. I'm thinking that whenever I'm not with you, I'm looking forward to the next time I will be. And I'm thinking that whatever this is between us, it feels important. Like something worth exploring properly. The sincerity in Jake's voice made Ethan's chest tighten with emotion. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to be this vulnerable with someone, to open himself up to the possibility of something real. His past relationships had left him cautious, hesitant to believe that someone like Jake, someone so full of life and charm and possibility, could genuinely want him. I feel the same way, Ethan admitted, his voice quiet but steady. And it scares me a little, how much I want this. How much I want you. Jake squeezed his hand reassuringly. Fear isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it just means you're about to do something really, really brave. Ethan considered this, then nodded slowly. So we're doing this? You and me, giving this a real shot. I'd like that, Jake replied, his smile returning. Very much. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with possibility and the unspoken promise of what might come next. The first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the stars fading as the night gave way to morning. Soon, the city would awaken fully, the peaceful quiet of these early hours replaced by the hustle and energy of a new day. We should probably go back inside, Ethan said eventually, though he made no move to release Jake's hand. Check on what's left of the party. Jake glanced through the glass door, where only a handful of guests remained, most looking ready to depart. Or, he suggested, a playful glint in his eye. We could stay out here a little longer. Watch the sunrise together. The idea was appealing, extending this magical bubble of time where it was just the two of them, suspended above the world. I'd like that, Ethan said, squeezing Jake's hand. Though I should warn you, I might start analyzing the color palette of the sky. Occupational hazard of being an artist. Jake laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I wouldn't expect anything less. In fact, I'm counting on it. He pulled Ethan closer, wrapping an arm around his waist. Besides, seeing the world through your eyes is one of my favorite things. As they stood together, waiting for the sunrise, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at how differently this night had turned out from what he'd expected. When he'd stepped out onto the balcony hours earlier, seeking a moment of solitude, he could never have anticipated that it would become the setting for such a profound shift in his life. That Jake would close that sliding door, creating a space where truths could finally be spoken. That a simple conversation would lead to a kiss that felt like the beginning of something significant. The city stretched out before them, a landscape of possibilities as vast and varied as the emotions swirling within Ethan's chest. Fear, yes, but also hope, excitement, and a quiet joy that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within him. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they might face, this moment, this perfect, quiet moment on a balcony at dawn, would remain etched in his memory as the point where everything changed. Jake pressed a gentle kiss to Ethan's temple, and Ethan leaned into the touch, allowing himself to believe that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings can arise from the most unexpected moments. Like two people finding each other on a balcony at 3 a.m., brave enough to close a door and open their hearts instead. Total _char_count. 18,842.